At my housewarming party, my sister smiled and handed my son a mocktail. "Drink up, Billy. I made it just for you." I bent down as if to fix his shoes and quietly swapped the cup with her husband's. Minutes later, I watched my sister-in-law poison my son's drink at my own housewarming party, and I didn't say a word. I set down my platter. I walked over slowly. I made an excuse about his shoelace, and while I fumbled with his laces with one hand, I lifted the pink fizzing drink from his fingers with the other and set it on the side table next to my brother-in-law, Derek, who was staring at his phone and not paying attention to anything. Then I picked up Derek's identical drink, same pink color, same paper umbrella, same pineapple wedge, completely untouched, and handed it to my son. Same cup, same smile, same party. Nobody noticed. Diane was already laughing with a neighbor across the room, her back to us, moving through my house with the comfortable ease of a woman who had already decided it was hers. 5 minutes later, Derek's hand went to his throat, and I watched Diane's face instead of Derek's. That's the part people ask about when I tell this story. Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you say something? And the honest answer is that I didn't know. Not for certain. Not with the kind of certainty that justifies accusations at a party full of your dead wife's family. What was in that cup? I had a feeling, a specific cold animal feeling that I'd been dismissing for 14 months because grief makes you distrust your own instincts. I stopped dismissing it the moment I saw Diane's eyes check my son's face for symptoms that weren't there. That flash of relief, gone in under a second, mask back on. I already knew. I need to take you back 14 months to the part of the story that isn't dramatic, but matters more than any of the rest of it. My wife Sarah...
I'm not going to describe the grief in detail, because if you've lost someone, you already know. And if you haven't, description doesn't cover it. What I will say is that grief makes you permeable. The walls between yourself and other people become thinner, and you trust more than you should, and you accept help from people whose motives you would normally scrutinize because you are operating at reduced capacity. And every small thing someone does to ease the weight of a day feels like genuine kindness. Diane had stepped into that permeability and occupied it completely. She was Sarah's older sister, 41 years old, always polished in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. Hair blow-dried, clothes assembled, the kind of presentation that requires maintenance. She and Sarah had never been close. Not really. Sarah mentioned it occasionally, in the elliptical way she mentioned things that were complicated, and I hadn't pushed. But after Sarah died, Diane was there consistently, reliably, relentlessly there. Meals delivered, logistics managed. She knew where the insurance documents were before I did. She had opinions about Billy's grief counselor and his school and the house. Looking back, the word I keep returning to is positioned. She positioned herself perfectly, and I was too hollowed out to see the architecture of it. She was married to Derek Calloway, a quiet, thin-shouldered man who worked in insurance and had the defeated quality of someone who'd been in the company of a stronger personality for so long that his own had largely dissolved. He came where Diane brought him. He agreed with whatever Diane said. I'd had maybe 30 real conversations with him in 6 years and couldn't have told you his opinions on anything. Billy was 7 by the time I started coming back to myself. He had his mother's laugh, sudden and complete, and he was obsessed with baseball cards and had mild asthma that required a rescue inhaler he wore in a small belt clip like a tiny sheriff. He was the reason I eventually climbed back up. Not because grief resolves, but because a 7-year-old needs someone fully present, and the need is more powerful than anything else I've experienced. The housewarming party was genuine optimism. I'd bought the house 8 months after Sarah passed,
Smaller, different neighborhood, nothing soaked in what used to be. And I'd spent a year rebuilding it by hand, slowly, on weekends, learning skills I didn't have and making mistakes and learning from them. Edison lights strung in the living room, fresh hardwood in the kitchen, a backyard I'd fenced myself, slightly crooked in one section, which I decided to leave as a reminder that I'd built it. I invited family, just family. 24 people, platters of food, Billy's cousins chasing the dog through the yard. It was a good night, right up until the pink drink. Here is the detail that I turned over and over in the weeks before the party without knowing what to do with it. 7 months after Sarah died, during a period when I was barely functional, Diane had gently, carefully suggested I signed some paperwork. Practical things, she said. Given that I was a single parent now, she wanted to make sure there were protections in place. She said Sarah would have wanted it. She said the words "just in case" 4 times in the conversation. I signed a power of attorney. I was not an idiot before my wife died. I was a reasonably intelligent structural engineer with a decent head for documentation. But I was in the kind of fog where the words on a page don't quite connect to meaning.
And Diane had put a pen in my hand, and I signed it. A year later, going through a drawer looking for Billy's vaccination records, I found my copy. I read it for the first time. Clause 14B. Temporary guardianship of any minor in the care of the principal transfers to the designated agent in the event that the principal is deemed by a licensed physician to be incapacitated or otherwise unable to provide adequate care. The designated agent was Diane. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My coffee went cold. I read the clause 4 more times. I looked at my signature at the bottom. My handwriting visibly worse than usual. The handwriting of someone who was not fully there. Then I went through the bank records. I'd added Diane to a household account 11 months before to manage some bills when I was traveling for work.
I'm a structural engineer. I understand load-bearing problems. I understand the difference between a support beam and a weight that's been quietly compromising the foundation. I didn't go to the police. Not yet, because I had bank records and a suspicious document. But what I didn't have was anything that connected those things to intent. $43,000 and a broadly written power of attorney? A good lawyer could build a reasonable explanation for both. I needed more. I didn't have to wait long. The party was a Saturday in October. By 7 p.m., the house was comfortable and warm with 24 people. The Edison lights doing exactly what I'd hoped. Billy running wild with his cousins in the backyard while the adults cycled between the kitchen and the living room. I noticed Diane in the kitchen at 7:20. She was making drinks. Not unusual. She was the type to organize bar operations at any gathering. Laughing with 2 cousins, mixing something pink and fizzing in a tall glass, paper umbrella, pineapple wedge. She was performing enjoyment, and she was good at it. And I watched her from the doorway for a moment before she saw me, and I went back to carrying a platter. At 7:34, I was on the back porch getting a second tray when I heard her voice through the screen door. The specific drop-in register she used when she was saying something she didn't want widely heard. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the name Billy. I came inside and found her crouched in the living room doorway, the pink drink in both hands. Billy in front of her with the open, uncomplicated happiness of a kid being handed sugar. Her shoulders were up near her ears. Her eyes were fixed on his fingers, closing around the cup. That look, I have thought about that look every day since. It was the look of someone who has been patient for a long time and is watching the final step of a plan arrive and is monitoring it with the focused attention of someone who cannot afford a mistake.
It was not how you look at a child you love. I set down my tray, kept my face easy, walked over. "Hey, bud, let me check your shoe real quick." Derek hit the floor at 7:51 p.m. The sound was a wet, rattling cough that cut through every other sound in the room, the way sudden wrongness does. Complete, instant reorientation of every person present. His face flushed, then drained. His knees buckled. The cup hit the hardwood and shattered. People shouted. Someone called 911. 2 people knelt beside Derek. The room compressed into organized panic. I did not move toward Derek. I watched Diane. She froze for 3 full seconds. Her eyes went to Derek, then to Billy, standing 4 feet away, eating a cookie, completely unaffected, not coughing, not flushed. Then to the shattered cup on the floor. The calculation was fast, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. Then, mask on, pivot to Derek. He must be allergic to something. "Derek, baby, stay with me!" Loud, performative, hands hovering just above him without quite touching. Eyes still checking Billy, checking for symptoms that weren't there. I went to the kitchen and got a syringe from the first aid kit. I collected what remained in Billy's original cup, the one I'd set on the side table, the one Derek hadn't been near, and sealed it in a mason jar.
I put the mason jar in the back of the refrigerator, behind the lasagna. My hands didn't shake. I find that detail meaningful, not because I was calm, but because something had settled into a different register. Past fear, past confusion, into the cold and operational clarity of someone who understands exactly what's happening and exactly what needs to happen next. The EMTs arrived at 7:58. Derek was conscious but impaired, speech slurred, coordination poor. He was transported to Mercy General. Diane rode in the ambulance, which meant she left the house, which meant she couldn't monitor what I did next. I stood in my living room after the guests had thinned out, and Billy was in bed. And I thought about Sarah, who had loved her sister with the complicated, cautious love of someone who knew better and did it anyway. Then I started making a list. The private lab is called Meridian Analytical Services, and they do independent forensic analysis for attorneys and insurance companies. I had them via a referral from a colleague, and I called them at 8:30 the following morning.
A senior analyst named Dr. Patricia O'Hay, 12 years in forensic toxicology, told me to keep the sample cold and bring it in sealed. And she had preliminary results in 48 hours. Benzoazepine, specifically triazolam, she explained, which is fast-acting, heavily sedating, and at the concentration she detected in the sample, she'd estimated the total dose, based on the volume remaining, sufficient to cause loss of consciousness in a child, particularly a child with a compromised respiratory system, particularly a child with asthma. She used the phrase potentially fatal, and then paused in the way of someone who chooses their words carefully and wants to make sure they've landed. They landed. I went to my attorney the same afternoon, Constance Park, 24 years in family law, who had helped me update my will after Sarah died, and who had called me twice in the 14 months since to make sure Billy and I were okay. She was the first person I showed the bank records to, and she was very quiet for a long time while she read them. "You need to know," she said, "that this power of attorney is voidable, and given the totality of what you're showing me, I believe it was obtained under fraudulent circumstances."
How long does that take? I'm filing to vacate it today. She looked at me over the documents. The financial records alone constitute a case with the toxicology report. She stopped. Owen, do you know what she was actually trying to do? I know exactly what she was trying to do, I said. I need to be able to prove it.
That's when she told me about the recording. My cousin Maggie is 23 and was, at the time of the party, hiding in my pantry, texting someone she didn't want her mother to know about. I am not going to elaborate on that because it's her story to tell if she wants to. What matters is that she was in the pantry with the door barely open and her phone recording a voice memo she'd started to capture something else. And at 7:16 p.m., she caught 14 seconds of audio from 2 feet away from Diane and whoever she was talking to near the kitchen counter.
It's not enough. We need him to drink all of it.
Female voice, Diane's voice. Constance Park hired an audio forensics specialist to confirm the voice match, a woman named Raina Faber, 18 years doing forensic audio analysis, who submitted a formal report to the county DA's office 6 weeks after the party. I had the toxicology report.
I had the financial records. I had the power of attorney and its fraudulent circumstances. I had 14 seconds of audio. I had the original cup, sealed and labeled, with chain of custody documentation that Dr. O.C. had helped me establish. I filed copies of everything in 3 separate locations: my attorney's office, a fireproof safe at my house, and a safety deposit box. And then I walked into the county police department and asked to speak to a detective. Detective Allison Varga had been with the county for 16 years, the last 9 in crimes against persons. She was thorough and unhurried, and she asked me to explain everything twice, taking notes the second time. She asked about Derek, who had recovered fully, who had spent 2 days in the hospital and been told he'd had a serious reaction to an unknown substance, who, as far as I knew, had not yet connected his wife to what happened to him. She asked whether Billy had shown any symptoms. She asked about my instinct in the moment, why I'd switched the cups before I had any certainty about what was in it. I had a feeling, I said. What kind of feeling? The kind I should have trusted 14 months earlier. She looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook and moved on. Diane came to my door on a Thursday, 11 days after the party. Beige cardigan, soft makeup, hair slightly less constructed than usual. The concerned relative costume, calibrated for accessibility, for warmth. She had a container of soup she'd made, which I accepted because refusing it would have been a tell. "You seem like you're carrying a lot," she said inside my hallway, looking around the house with the eyes of someone assessing a property. "With everything, the party, Derek being sick, and you handling it all alone, I've been thinking you might need some support." She paused, constructing the next sentence with the care she always brought to this. "Someone to help with Billy, consistently, so you can breathe." I looked at her. 14 months of dinners and logistics and managed paperwork and patient positioning. 14 months of her hands in my house, in my accounts, in the documents around my life. 14 months of her waiting, I understood now, for the right moment to use the thing she'd put in place. The clause, the guardianship provision, the architecture she'd been building since before my wife's body was cold. She needed me incapacitated or discredited. She needed Billy sick or impaired. She needed the power of attorney to be active and unchallenged. She needed Sarah's house, Sarah's assets, Sarah's son. She had loved Sarah's life more than she'd ever loved Sarah. "I have support," I said. "I have a family law attorney, a forensic accountant." I watched her face and a recording of your voice. The warmth drained out of her like water through a hole. The process was fast, but visible. The architecture of the performance failing from the inside out. The warmth becoming blankness, becoming something else, something harder and colder, and entirely honest for the first time in my experience of her.
"You can't prove anything," she said. It came out as a whisper. "I already did." She left without the soup container. Diane was arrested on a Tuesday. The charges were attempted poisoning of a minor, attempted poisoning of an adult, financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, and fraud in the obtainment of a legal document. Constance Park had worked with the DA's office for 2 weeks on the filing. Detective Varga made the arrest at Diane's house at 8:45 a.m. I heard about it from Constance, who texted me the moment she had confirmation. I was at Billy's baseball practice. He was at the plate, helmet slightly too big as always, and I was on the bleachers with the other parents.
Drinking bad coffee from a thermos, watching him swing at a pitch and miss, and absolutely not care. He didn't look at me for validation when he missed. He just repositioned his feet and waited for the next one. I thought about Sarah watching him do that. The way she would have leaned forward, elbows on knees, completely absorbed. I thought about how close it had been. I looked at Constance's text, then I put my phone in my pocket and watched my son hit the next pitch. Not well, not far, but solidly, the clean crack of contact, and run for first base with everything he had. The preliminary hearing was 6 weeks later. I wasn't required to testify at that stage, but I attended, and I watched Diane in the defendant's chair, in a way I hadn't watched her before. Without the filter of family, without the accumulated small courtesies of years, without the overlay of Sarah's love for her, she was a person who had decided at some point, I'll never know exactly, that she deserved what someone else had built, and that the most efficient path to it was to dismantle the person who built it, brick by brick, in the name of support.
The grief had been a gift to her. My vulnerability had been a material she'd used. I thought about the hardwood floor I'd laid myself, the fence in the backyard that was slightly crooked in one section because I was learning as I went. The Edison lights still strung across the living room, still on every evening when Billy came home from school. I'd built something in that house. Not perfectly, slightly crooked in places, but I'd built it, and it was mine, and she didn't get it. Derek Calloway filed for divorce 3 weeks after Diane's arrest. I don't know what happened in that house between them after the toxicology report made clear what had been in his drink. The drink his wife had made at a party that he picked up without thinking. There's a version of Derek's life before this where he was simply a man who had quietly gone along with things he should have questioned. And this was the consequence of that. And I don't know what he does with it. I hope he figures it out. The $43,300 was recovered through a civil case.
Constance described the process as efficient, which I understood was her highest word for things. The power of attorney was vacated. Billy is 8 now. His asthma has been well managed, he has strong opinions about baseball cards, and recently, alarmingly, about cooking. He wants to learn, wants to make things, asks questions about ingredients. I am teaching him. We make things together in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Music on, mess everywhere, and I watch him the way you watch something precious and unrepeatable. And I think about pink drinks and paper umbrellas, and the weight of a specific small decision I made on a Saturday night in October. I switched the cups. That's all I did. The rest of it was already there, waiting to be found. The records, the document, the audio, the toxicology report. The truth was already built. It just needed someone to go looking. I had a feeling. I learned to trust it.